Welcome back to Cyber Defense Webinars. I'm Pete Green, the CISO of Cyber Defense Magazine. Before we get started, I want to thank you for attending this on-demand webinar, and don't forget to stay to the end and document your attendance for self-reporting CPE credits. As engineering velocity accelerates, traditional GRC models are failing. Manual controls, point-in-time audits, and reactive evidence collection can't keep up with modern cloud and CI/CD environments. So today we're talking about a new class of GRC leaders, those who refuse to let compliance slow the business down. This conversation is about engineering compliance for speed, scale, and trust. Today's cyber defense webinar is being brought to you by RegScale. RegScale turns compliance from a checkbox into a real-time strategic advantage. Visit them online at regscale.com. So let's welcome our guest speakers. We're so glad to have you here with us today. Shannon, if you could introduce yourself and then we could just go down the line.
Hi, I'm Shannon Williams. I'm a senior solution advisor at RegScale, and I help our clients get into our platform and see their first value as they start using the RegScale product.
Hello, I'm Fendi. I'm the security assurance automation team lead at GitLab, and we focus on building custom engineering solutions to solve governance, risk, and compliance issues.
Hi, I'm Niall Heffernan. I'm staff GRC analyst at Tynes. I'm responsible for our end-to-end compliance posture.
That's great. Thank you all for being here. We're really looking forward to your insights on this important subject today. And before we get started, let me just give you an introduction on our first slide, our first discussion, which is compliance is no longer a checkbox. So we know that engineering velocity has outpaced the cadence of annual audits, and that exposes the limits of manual point-in-time compliance, which simply does not scale in modern environments. So as a result, organizations are left with reactive evidence collection that increases risk and drives burnout across security and engineering teams. Forward-looking leaders recognize the shift and now treat compliance as infrastructure, a built-in, continuously operating capability rather than a paperwork exercise. And so my first question is for you, Shannon. What does compliance as code mean in practice?
Compliance as code is baking compliance into your processes that help build your infrastructure. This can look like rule-based enforcement, as well as automatically collecting evidence as infrastructure is being spun up, so that you are proactively working compliance into your DevSecOps lifecycle.
Great. And Niall, how does automation reduce friction without slowing delivery?
Yeah, so I think the friction usually isn't because GRC and developers see security differently. It's because they run into compliance at different stages of their workflows. So developers feel it more at when a release is blocked, where GRC tends to feel it more when we don't have evidence to prove a control at audit time. So automation tends to help when compliance lives inside the workflow rather being tacked on at the end. So it replaces that manual follow-up to a real-time visibility into whether controls are actually in place and working. And then for developers, like the best automation is barely noticeable to them. And then for GRC, it means like fewer chasing up, tracing evidence, taking screenshots, reaching out to individual team members. So when you get that balance right, like automation doesn't slow delivery, but actually helps teams move faster.
Excellent. Thank you. And let's end up with you, Ayub. So how do teams embed compliance into CI/CD so that engineers don't notice it?
Yeah, there's several ways to think about it. I think when you think about CI/CD, you often have a CI YAML file, well, all kind of the different stages that are happening inside the build are mentioned and detailed. And it's very easy for GRC teams to work with the security team and the engineers to embed inside the manifest specific security controls around kind of a SAST, for example, for testing or ensuring proper protection of the code that is deployed and ensuring that all those controls are embedded So when the pipeline runs, it's seamless for the engineers, but you get the artifacts coming from the build, but you also ensure 100% compliance in the branches that you care about the most.
Okay, very good. So you kind of sneak it in there. That's great. Let's go back
Exactly.
to Shannon. Shannon, why does traditional compliance break down as organizations scale, and what mindset shift separates modern GRC leaders from the rest?
Yeah, so a lot of our compliance original requirements were developed long before we were utilizing cloud technology. And I know a lot of those organizations are looking to update those frameworks, but a lot of the root requirements are based on concepts of when environments are a bit more tangible and physical and difficult to set up. So when we look at scale today, our forward-thinking GRC leaders are looking at this compliance as code concept and methodology to be able to ensure compliance as we are a little bit more ephemeral with our technology. We can spin things up. And so baking in that compliance as we're building it so that it is not impeding our engineers from being able to move at the lightning speeds that they're moving these days, but then also taking in that compliance into consideration. So not necessarily making it a stop sign or a roadblock, but baking it into their processes.
Okay, very good. And I guess the next question I'll send to Niall. So why does compliance feel so painful today? And how does reframing it as an operational system change outcomes?
Yeah, I think compliance feels painful because it's usually treated as a check the box admin exercise instead of security initiative. So GRC teams spend more time pulling screenshots and chasing evidence than mapping the same controls across frameworks than actually designing good controls or talking about risk or making those key risk decisions. So when you reframe compliance as an operational system, everything shifts, right? So you move from a compliance first mindset to a security first mindset. So where compliance is just a byproduct of doing security well, it starts becoming like natural as part of your security practices. So that reframing also changes the core question. Instead of asking, do we have the evidence for this control? You ask, can we continuously see whether this control is working? So having the observable evidence comes from normal operations instead of last minute scrambles.
Excellent. Ayub, from a DevSecOps perspective, so what happens when compliance is just bolted on instead of built in?
So I was saying, I think the main issue you will have is as you ship potentially tens of times per day, it could be more. There's an insane velocity, especially now at the edge of AI, that has exploded the number of lines of code pushed to production every day. I think the issue, if you think about it as bolted on, is you're trying to at the end of the process, once everything is in production, you might have some vulnerabilities, you might not have the right control enforced in production, instead of working with the developers at the design phase and the early stages where anything that you need to fix is a lot less costly because there's nothing that is currently being showcased to customers. When you wait until it's in production, the cost is I think we had a study at GitLab, I think it's 37x what it would be if it's in the design phase. And I think that differentiating cost is also because there's also a customer disruption that happens when you have to break down production to make some changes. So bolted on is often after the fact, we just ad hoc or see something and then we have to kind of react. Whereas if you embed it in the design phase and throughout the pipeline, you have automated checks that are embedded in the way they already do their work, then you ensure that you get what you want in terms of like kind of artifacts and proofs from the build stage, but also you ensure that the secure requirements are baked in at the design phase.
Great. Thank you all for that on this discussion. Great responses and shocking responses, especially on that 37x. That's astonishing. Let's move on to our next topic. Build compliance where work happens. And we realize that compliance should be shifted left in the design build stages, where it becomes part of how systems are created rather than something checked after the fact. Controls primarily are treated as versioned testable assets, which are enforced directly inside CI/CD pipelines instead of through manual reviews. This approach eliminates brittle handoffs between GRC, security, and engineering, creating a single integrated compliance workflow that moves at the same speed as development. So that's the topic that we're going to discuss. And Ayub, let's start it off with you. I'm going to ask you this question. How can teams embed compliance directly into CI/CD pipelines so engineers don't have to think about it separately?
Yeah, I would probably point out two ways. So the first way we discussed a little bit, where we kind of describe in the YAML file everything we need to happen inside the CI/CD pipeline, and we can ensure, especially the things we care about throughout the build, in terms of embedding scanning, having dependency scanning, license scanning, all of these be embedded in the pipeline, especially where the code that will end up going through it at some point will be deployed in production. So that's one way of doing it. But of course, you also need to catch things before. So of course, when we ship code, we first create a merge request once we've kind of worked on a specific feature locally. And then we have the process where we need to approve that, then the build can start. And there, common controls that we like to see are ensuring we enforce stuff like a separation of duties. So ensuring the individual that created the merge request is not the one that actually merges it. And we have concepts like code owners that ensure that specific kinds of people in different teams are the ones allowed to review the code. So people that really know the code base can review it before changes. And we find that controlled in most compliance requirements. And another one is ensuring that you have, for specific kind of merge request, security involved. So you can also ensure for specific types of merge requests that someone maybe from the application security team or security engineer should review the code that's going to be merged before we start. So you combine automated testing, but also specific security expertise when you need it the most.
Okay, very good. Let's move on to Shannon. What does compliance as code actually mean in practice? How does it change collaboration between GRC and engineering?
Yeah, so when I look at the tiles on the screen here, it's about building compliance requirements in our design and build phases and making sure that they're baked in there. It also looks like conducting automated assessments, particularly during that testing and onboarding phases, creating that audit documentation on an automatic basis so that the evidence is already there, and then automating that evidence collection so that we are reducing the dependency the GRC team has on individuals within the engineering team. This will keep the compliance team focused on their goals of gathering this information and ensuring that compliance, and then the engineering team more focused on their main tasks of building and releasing the latest and greatest that they have. So I think it improves the way in which each part of the organization is working together through building it in automatically and allowing them to be more focused on their main tasks.
So basically taking certain portions of their workflow, automating them and allowing them to do other things that are probably more important.
Yeah, or just more exciting for them, right? I don't know an
Yeah,
engineer that's too excited about doing the compliance work, right?
right. Right, right, right. So Niall, how does automation reduce friction between GRC teams and developers without slowing down that delivery component?
Yeah, I think the friction usually isn't because GRC and developers see security differently. It's because they run into compliance at like different times. So developers feel it when a release gets blocked, where GRC it's more we're missing evidence. So like the automation helps there massively by living within those workflows.
Okay. Okay. And let me ask you a follow-up question to that. Which GRC tasks deliver the fastest ROI when they're automated?
Yeah, and it's kind of piggybacking what Shannon said as well. So like evidence collection is probably the obvious place to start, like access reviews, configuration checks, asset inventories. Like the information is already there, but most teams are still pulling screenshots and follow up with engineers and looking for evidence across their infrastructure, where automating that will saves a huge amount of time and will help me move teams from like that audit panic to like an audit readiness. So another area with fast returns is like control mapping. So most teams are already meeting the intent of multiple frameworks, but they still kind of treat each one like separate work. So automation lets them reuse the same controls instead of rewriting and re-explaining them every time. So automation delivers like return on investment fastest when it kind of removes that kind of manual coordination work and like evidence chasing, and everything should just be there and ready to go.
Right, right. Turn a quarterly review into a much shorter time frame.
Exactly, yeah.
Um, so Ayub, how can tooling generate audit trails automatically?
I would say in that specific area, I think a lot of tools that we use on day to day that relate to some of the controls that we care about, they already produce a lot of telemetry. I think especially now. So for example, talking about DevSecOps platforms, often you have the ability to pull through an audit trail or audit events, pull data coming from the merge requests, coming from the CI builds, and being able to ingest them elsewhere. So if you have a GRC platform, you can ingest them in there. If you use like kind of a project management solution, you can ingest them. And you have also like automation tooling that can also do the steps. And either you can embed them inside the CI, so they also capture that data and push it over, or some of them they natively integrate with the DevSecOps platform. And I think now, I think it's just as GRC teams were kind of a lot inward facing, so less caring about the kind of the experience of control owners when they work with us. But if you think about it from their perspective and you think about what tools they use, often like the kind of the uplift to get the data is not as much as what we think. We just have to think about it their way and think about them as customers so we understand the customer journey of giving us evidence every year or every quarter.
Change our mindset a little bit. Yeah. So Shannon, let's wrap up with you here on this topic. How does automated evidence change daily GRC work?
Mhm. Yeah, so it changes you from being more reactive every single time you're going through an audit, be it every year, every 3 years, every 6 months, depending on your audit cycles, right? And moving you into a more proactive stance so that when the auditors come, you already have the information that you can automate, and so that you're only focused on ad hoc requests that might occur during your audits. I think in general, it creates less of a fire drill during your audit season because you have that confidence for everything that's already been proactively collected for you.
And that could also, and I know that this probably isn't on the same topic, but that could also prepare you for a board level meeting because you have the evidence already available, and when they ask for the evidence, you have it.
We're more and more we're seeing newsworthy, highlights of the costs of not being compliant. And so our boards are getting more interested in making sure that you're proactively doing your job, and they want to know ahead of time whether they need to gauge for that kind of risk. So doing some type of automation, proactive work there is going to be able to give you a more satisfactory answer to your board at the end of the day.
Sure. Great. Well, thank you for that discussion. That was really enlightening. Let's move on to the next topic. So now we'll talk continuous evidence, continuous confidence, and the manual evidence collection should be absolutely eliminated in favor of automated control validation and continuously updated documentation, as we've been saying. Evidence is centralized across cloud platforms. It's found everywhere in security tooling, in development systems, and it creates a single source of truth. So this shift that we're talking about replaces last minute audit panic with a steady state of audit readiness, reducing risk while freeing teams to focus on higher value work. So that's really what we're going to talk about when we get into continuous evidence. And so let me start it off, Shannon, with you. How should GR teams operationalize SBOM data?
Mhm. Yeah, so an SBOM data is going to be key in understanding your security and your compliance posture, because you need to know your inventory to be able to accurately answer those types of questions. In Visualizing, that word's hard for me. SBOM data, I'll work on it.
You did good.
Um, I recommend looking at standards like Cyclone DX or SPDX to be able to install a common language to describe your software. And then once you know what you have to protect, it allows you to more confidently answer to your compliance-based questions. I think very specifically back to where we were in 2024. I was a cybersecurity advisor at that point in time. And when the large scale SolarWinds event was happening, a lot of organizations were scrambling to be able to answer to their board, their executive team of, are we impacted to this? And having an SBOM, ready to go gives you that quick answer of yes, we are impacted and this is going to be our next steps. Or no, we're not, we're good, and we can move on with the next thing. I just found that a lot of time was spent at that beginning phase of trying to identify whether you were impacted instead of being able to more actively respond to the event itself. So, when I think about operationalizing that SBOM data, further that it would be, trying to do your best to automate that collection of your SBOM data. So being able to build in ways to grab, what is in the ingredient list for all of your builds, and being able to document that and have a consistent list running so you actively know, day to day what's being deployed in your environments.
The exact components that are they're making up your environment at any given time, automated in an automated way, being pulled in
Mhm.
for evidence collection. I like that. So, Niall, let me ask you, how does automation speed response to supply chain risk?
Yeah, and again, it kind of piggybacks a lot of what Shannon just said. So, like, supply chain risk is mostly a time problem. So, like, when something changes, like a vendor issue or a vulnerable dependency, the delay usually comes from the uncertainty. So, like, do we use this vendor? How critical is it to our infrastructure? Until those questions are answered, like, response generally slows down or even stalls in some cases. So, automation helps by kind of collapsing that uncertainty. Window greatly. So like you with automated visibility into vendors, dependencies, and how they map to systems and controls, your teams can move quickly from that something happened phase to where we're exposed and how can we fix it phase. So it also improves kind of the prioritization as well. So instead of treating every supplier issue as like a fire drill, your automation factors in things like the data sensitivity of your infrastructure and your components, the system criticality, is it exposed to the internet? So that gives your teams time just to focus on what actually matters to reduce that risk rather than that kind of like scrounging around in the dark trying to find what
Right.
actually is happening.
Right, right. Very valuable. And so let me ask Ayub, where do SBOMs fit naturally into DevSecOps?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty natural fit. I think if you think about the history of DevSecOps, DevOps, finished project, huge revolution in the way we thought about software and kind of getting the kind of IT and operations combined with some of the work developers were doing. So we had a better connection between people that created the software and people that shipped and then kind of maintained it in production. And I think when you add the sec in the middle, SBOM is a perfect example just because the SBOM is the full list of like the libraries, the dependencies leveraged for that software. So when the security team thinks about it, they have an architecture of how the software that is being built looks like. And the developer can have the exact same vision. So we can finally share kind of a translation where we can have this looking at the same thing. And when, for example, there's availability, we need to understand our exposure as the previous panelists talked about. It's very easy when you have the exact same thing you're looking at to understand where we need to focus on, what dependency we might have to update, what the impact is in production, where there's like maybe knock-on dependencies we have to think about. And I think there's a natural fit just because it's that common kind of format through which you can communicate between developers and security engineers, which, as most people that have worked in the space know, it can sometimes be a bit like it's not frictionless. Let's say that.
That's being a CISO in so many different organizations, that ability to speak the same language is often the biggest challenge. So thank you for that. That's a good perspective there. Let's move on to our next topic, which is supply chain compliance at scale. And the supply chain is really the challenge of working with companies outside of our own, uh, immediate environment, and working with companies that may share our data, may access our data, may be using our data on a day-to-day basis. And how do we do compliance at scale with that supply chain? And so the questions that I have are going to be kind of focused on what that looks like. And Shannon, let me start off with you. Why is continuous assurance essential for scale?
Mhm. Yeah, so when we look at enterprises, it's not that they have a few systems, they might have hundreds. That supply chain list is going to be quite large. And in traditional GRC processes, there are requirements for formal and reoccurring manual testing against all of these systems. So the more and more that we can automate the assessment process of our supply chain, the more successful we are going to be at being able to um, be the department of yes rather than be the department of no. Or be the department of it might take 3 months for us to process that request for your new piece of technology. So being able to pull in some automation on that is going to be key. The other piece with supply chain is it's not only on the way in, it's that reoccurring analysis and making sure that your supply chain organizations are maintaining the same requirements that you held them to on the way in. And so having to do that continuous assessment of those organizations over time is going to be key as well to maintaining your supply chain risk. So any sort of shift left that we can do to automate that assessment is going to allow us a faster and a quicker way to measure the risk of all of these hundreds of systems at a scale.
Okay, very good. And I'm just gonna go down the line, and let's talk about supply chain compliance at scale. And Ayub, could you expand on kind of the problem there, and what some solutions are as far as addressing compliance at scale?
So related to kind of how we align speed and compliance, I think some of the key ways of thinking about it is you need to put yourself in the shoes of the control owners and the people involved in the process. And I think one good way is everything we discussed is around how we ensure we can self-serve all that data that is relevant for audit prep, that is relevant to ensure that we know how our controls are operating. And all of that is the burden now that we put on ourselves because we need that data. And I think something that we can do is showcase a win-win situation. So saving time is always nice. Everyone likes to save time. But I think when we can go above and beyond is to showcase, hey, we have all those data points from your systems, but also from other systems. And combining those data points to give net new insights back to control owners, which they didn't have because everyone has tunnel vision. And GRC outside the CISO is the only team that has that breadth. We can come back to them with more interesting insights, and then we can actually help drive some of the roadmaps and be more involved because we didn't come to them like take. We also had some give inside of that.
Okay, very good. Thank you for letting me put you on the spot there. And Niall, one automation step teams should take this quarter.
Yeah, I mean, I think if any teams to do one thing this quarter with automation, is just to like pick a task that's the most painful, the most manual that they can think of, and then work on that. So like you don't need to automate like end to end in terms of like trying to gather evidence for one control. It's more just start small and even automate something like pulling data from a few tools into one place, like SBOM perfect or for supply chain risk. So once you have that data centralized, your reviews get a lot easier because you have that single pane of glass. All right. So reporting gets faster and people stop redoing that kind of same manual work, especially on a quarterly basis, if it's quarterly access reviews or quarterly risk reviews as well. So the key is kind of momentum. So once you remove that one source of pain, prove value, and then you start building from there. So slowly building blocks, and it's just have fun doing it as well. Because you did some satisfaction as well when you do get an automation working. Well, I never have to open that spreadsheet again for a long time. Yeah, it's very satisfying.
Having fun doing GRC compliance. You don't hear that all the time. So that's that's something we can aspire to. That's great. Well, for sake of time, let's go to our next slide and let's kind of wrap it up here because this will give us a good idea of engineering compliance for speed and scale and those things that we can do in engineering to increase speed and reduce scale. So let's I'm just going to ask you one question, and we're going to call this the lightning round. Let's go down the line, Shannon, Ayub, and Niall. One sentence. What should modern GRC leaders do differently starting tomorrow?
Yeah,
Shannon?
so um, my thoughts here is that our traditional compliance teams tend to not have engineers on them. Consider getting compliance engineers to help solve these problems for you because everything we described today is something that is going to need that engineering mindset to be able to accomplish.
That's great. Thank you. And Ayub.
Yeah, for me, if I would have to pick one sentence, I would say move from audit driven to threat driven. And I would say that it kind of encompasses a lot of the switches we talked about, and being focused more on the outcome of security activities instead of the activities specifically related to audit prep, etc. Because telemetry should just flow from natural operations.
Thank you. And Niall.
Yeah, actually, I love Ayub's answer. I wish that was my one, but I think automation is one of the few places where leaders could definitely start investing in, especially investing their time into it. So it's one of the few places where the more time you invest in it up front, it keeps paying you back quarter after quarter.
That's great. So many great responses, and I think that we have encompassed kind of the idea that compliance can be automated. Compliance can be the skids on the compliance journey can be greased, and we can find shortcuts to get to what we have taken days and weeks and months to accomplish in the past. We can automate some of those things and find a better path to full compliance. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. Compliance is infrastructure. And to explain that, let's go down the line. Shannon, what does this mean? Compliance is infrastructure.
For me, it's innovation. It's taking some stagnant, more difficult manual tasks in the compliance space and automating it, building it into our processes in a way that yeah, I think totally innovates the entire audit process.
Okay, and what about you, Ayub?
Yeah, I was saying I'll take it from different angle to Shannon. I would say for me, infrastructure is invisible. So the goal here is like for once to be powering the teams without being the one that is kind of pointed at as annoying or kind of disrupting workflows. Infrastructure runs behind the scenes is a lot of work, but for consumers, it's seamless.
Great. And Niall?
Yeah, I think it's moving away from the mindset of compliance is just a once a year thing to think about, but actually being embedded in everything your business is doing across organizations, not just within engineering, but HR, IT, and have it kind of as that silent partner, but that silent foundation for all you do.
Excellent. Shannon, Niall, Ayub, incredibly informative. And here's what I learned through this process is that compliance doesn't have to be the Department of No. I really appreciated hearing that from you, Shannon. When engineered correctly, it becomes a competitive advantage. And I think all of you kind of stated that. Thank you so much to our panel for educating us on this critical topic. Folks, remember to visit them online and then come back next time for another exciting episode of Cyber Defense Webinars. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.